Now to an unwelcome surprise for U.S. intelligence, keeping tabs on the brutal war that has driven so many Syrians out of their homeland. It raises a chilling possibility that U.S. and Russian warplanes could wind up fighting on opposite sides.
We understand
that there is also a need for political change. We are working with our partners in Syria, and in general there is an understanding that this uniting of efforts in fighting terrorism should go in parallel to some political process in Syria itself. The Syrian president agrees with this, including holding early parliamentary elections and establishing contacts with the so-called healthy opposition to bring them into government. But first of all is the issue concerning Syria's internal situation.
Now, Russia says the anti-terrorism fight in Syria can become efficient only if demands for the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad are withdrawn. The United States and some of its allies, as well as the Syrian opposition, have made such demands. The conflict in Syria has claimed the lives of nearly 250,000 people, but warring sides still seem far from a solution to end the crisis.
Russia's foreign minister says Bashar al-Assad is the legitimate president of Syria and that his troops are the only forces fighting against the Daesh Takfiri terrorists in the war-torn country.
If the totally unrealistic and counterproductive demands which are being voiced by some of our partners regarding the resignation of Assad are withdrawn, we can work effectively. This is the initiative of the Russian president.
Lavrov said the current conflict has to be brought to an end through dialogue among Syrian parties. The UN Security Council also last month stressed that diplomacy is the solution to the over 4-year conflict, calling for the crisis to be resolved through political process led by the Syrian groups.
The Security Council welcomes the Secretary General's statement of 29th of July 2015 that there can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict, and reiterates its endorsement of a political solution through implementation of the Geneva Communique.
The Council statement endorsed the initiative by the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura. He proposed the formation of a transitional government in the Arab country. The Geneva I and Geneva II peace conferences on Syria, which were held in June 2012 and February 2014, failed to resolve the crisis, though they called for principles and guidelines for a political transition that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. The talks failed to pave the way for the transition as foreign-backed militants and opposition groups insisted on the removal of President Bashar al-Assad from power. Many analysts believe that any dialogue to resolve the Syrian crisis must involve Syria's legitimate president, who has been elected through a popular vote and has the support of the majority of Syrians.
It's very clear that President Assad has substantial support among the citizens of Syria. There's no basis for excluding him from any power-sharing negotiations that take place. If we're serious about a resolution of this conflict, we must take account of all the anti-terrorist groups in Syria. And certainly President Assad represents a serious factor in opposing the terrorists.
Syria has been battling foreign-sponsored militancy since March 2011. The US and its regional allies, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, have been actively supporting the Takfiri terrorists from the start of the crisis. The US military has set up training camps for the so-called moderate militants and sent them into Syria. But many of the so-called moderate militants joined the ISIL ranks over the past years. Back in 2012, the CIA reportedly used Jordanian bases to train militants who later joined the ISIL in Syria. The commander of the Quds force of Iran's Islamic Revolution Guards Corps says the United States is using the ISIL terrorist group as a lever to achieve its goals in the Middle East. It seems that any political push to end the conflict is doomed as long as the US and its Western and regional allies seek regime change instead of a genuine political path. The conflict, which has divided the Middle East, has so far killed 250,000 people and left a large part of Syria under ISIL control.
I know when the world will end. The sun will turn into a white dwarf. Other things will happen too. Now,
that will be the end of the world as we know it. So if this is what you mean by the end of the world, it will come even sooner. But I'm not afraid. It's inevitable.
And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws. And I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north waters, and all his bands, and many people with them. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm, thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee. Thus saith the Lord God. It shall also come to pass, that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought, and thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates, to take a spoil and to take a prey. To turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land. Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? Therefore, Son of man, prophesy, and say unto Gog, Thus saith the Lord God, In that day, when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army. And thou shalt come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land. It shall be in the latter days, I will bring thee against my land, that the heathen may know me, when I shall be sanctified in thee, O God, before their eyes. Thus saith the Lord God, Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old times by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? And it shall come to pass at the same time, when God shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the heaven and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep upon the earth, and all the men that are upon the face of the earth, shall shake at my presence. And the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Every man's sword shall be against his brother, and I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood. And I will rain upon him and upon his bands and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord.
Pentagon correspondent David Martin is breaking a story with ominous implications. The prospect of U.S. and Russian warplanes fighting on opposite sides in the skies over Syria.
It's a development that caught U.S. intelligence by surprise. Russia has set up an air traffic control tower and modular housing units for hundreds of personnel at an airfield near Syria's Mediterranean port of Latakia. At the same time, Russia has requested the necessary overflight rights to fly military cargo aircraft into the airfield. Some U.S. intelligence analysts believe Russia is preparing to insert combat aircraft into Syria, presumably to conduct strikes against rebel forces threatening its longtime ally, the regime of Bashar al-Assad. One U.S. official said Russian military intervention in Syria would be a game changer, among other things raising the possibility of run-ins with U.S. warplanes conducting airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. However, other analysts caution Russia could simply be gearing up for a humanitarian relief operation for the tens of thousands of Syrian civilians forced by the fighting to flee their homes. Appearing at an economic conference, Russia's President Putin said that although he continues to supply the Assad regime with arms, military intervention in Syria is, quote, not yet on our agenda.
But given Putin's track record of denying Russian military involvement in Ukraine, U.S. officials say they are not putting much stock in his public statements about Syria. For CBS This Morning Saturday, David Martin at the Pentagon.
New Russian military personnel and equipment on the ground inside Syria, U.S. military officials tell CNN. Potentially volatile addition to a bloody civil war already 4 years old. Secretary of State John Kerry called Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to warn such actions, quote, could further escalate the conflict. An allegation the Kremlin dismissed as premature. What's unclear is who the Russians intend to fight.
Is it to shore up the Assad regime? Is it to fight ISIS, or do we know?
You know full well that the Russians have had a long relationship with the government in Syria, and again, it's up to the Russians to explain exactly what they're doing.
Satellite images show Russia has installed modular units capable of housing hundreds of military personnel, a defense official tells CNN. And this image broadcast on Syrian state television, identified by analysts as a modern Russian-made armored vehicle not previously seen in Syria, and painted in Russian army camouflage.
What the Russians might or might not be doing at the moment that is of concern to Secretary Kerry, and who would replace Assad? Who would replace any of the other groups that are fighting for power?
Syria is Russia's key ally in the Middle East. Moscow also has a strategic naval base at Tartus in Syria. If the fragile regime of Bashar al-Assad falls, so too may Russian influence in the region. Russia and the United States had been talking about finding a political solution to the crisis, administration officials until recently expressing hope that Moscow was open to a future without Assad. Administration officials now making clear there is only one kind of military help the U.S. would welcome.
There's a 37-some-odd country coalition that's taking the fight to ISIL. We would welcome Russia to be more involved in that effort.
President Putin has admitted aiding the Syrian army in its fight against the rebels. The stories focus on what's described as the first official confirmation by the Kremlin. RT's Medina Kochnova joins me to help shed some light on this. Medina, just first of all, where did the story come from?
Well, it all started by a comment that was made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. Now, the president was talking about fighting ISIS in Syria and was asked to comment on some news reports that Russia is sending its military jets into Syria. And here's what the president said.
US jets are carrying out some airstrikes. So far, their efficiency has not been very high, and it's premature to say that we're ready to do the same. But we're already providing Syria with quite serious support, with vehicles, soldiers training, weapons. We have big contracts with Syria that were signed 5 to 7 years ago, and we're meeting our obligations in full.
Secretary of State John Kerry has called Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov about possible Russian military buildup in Syria. Joining me now is Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He is from Orlando. And General, what are you hearing about this? Because clearly this is a serious escalation.
The intelligence community has been watching this very closely, Martin, and it certainly would be troubling. As you know, Secretary Kerry has been working for some time to try and get a diplomatic solution, and in fact has been enlisting Russian help in this. All indicators, though, what the intelligence community is saying is the Russians are actually reinforcing the Assad regime, which could be extremely complicating our efforts in our fight against ISIS and also our attempt to get Assad to either step down or begin a better power sharing arrangement within his government.
And The concern here is how far are the Russians willing to go? I mean, it's one thing to provide weapons and ammunition. It's another to possibly provide advisors or even military troops. Where are they in this particular process?
Well, that's the unknown right now. And I think many of the intelligence analysts in Washington have determined that Assad is on his last legs. He's lost several fights recently. He's pulling into a defensive zone more and more around the capital. He has lost his allies in every source, with the exception perhaps of the Russians and the Iranians, although the Iranians are distracted in other places, specifically in Iraq. So this could be troubling depending on how far Russia goes. If they just bring in an advisor, that's one thing. It appears that they are bringing in a lot of equipment, which has the potential for contributing to aviation assets and airstrikes, which, when you're talking about this country, it would embroil the mix even more than it already is, as we're working with the Turks to strike in the north. The Saudi Arabians are very concerned. The Israelis are very concerned about this. But it all points to some of the meetings that the Russian hierarchy have had recently with not only Assad, but also with leaders out of Iran. As you know, General Soleimani has gone to Moscow recently.
Let me ask you this real quick. Of course, we know that the U.S. is carrying out airstrikes in Syria. Should there be a concern now for those people, those pilots, and that aircraft?
Well, certainly. There was always concern about the potential for engagements with Syrian aircraft. But imagine the scenario is if Russia begins,
That's exactly
and this is
what I'm thinking,
way down the road, if Russia begins their own airstrikes in support of the Assad regime, then you have the potential airstrikes with coalition forces and Russian-supported Syrian forces. So that just brings a whole nother level of complexity to this entire situation.
But in theory, though, both are trying to get rid of ISIS, and those that are, I guess in some ways we seem to be on the same page.
Well, to a degree. But you're also talking about how do you get rid of ISIS? If Russia backs the Syrian leadership, are they not only going after ISIS, but are they going after Free Syrian Army elements? Are they going after coalition? Are they going after Kurds? All of those are going against the Syrian regime. If there is an attempt at greater power sharing, that's one thing. If there's an attempt at common enemies, that's another. But I think as long as Assad is holding power without any changes in his government, without any attempt to enlighten his government toward their people, you're going to have many second and third order effects, to include a continued refugee crisis of all the individuals that are leaving Syria.
Right, which we've talked about all day.
The biggest catalyst for the mass migration to Europe is Syria's civil war, which is believed to have killed 250,000 people and driven an estimated 11 million Syrians from their homes. Secretary of State John Kerry warned Russia's foreign minister this weekend about reports of Russia increasing specific types of support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. Kerry says the increased support could escalate the conflict and the refugee crisis. Joining me now from Washington to discuss the war in Syria is Anthony Korsman, who is the Arlie A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sir, let's begin with Secretary of State Kerry's concerns. At this point in the conflict, what would a Russian infusion of support for Assad's army and his regime mean?
People are concerned as there's evidence that he may be providing, or Putin may be providing, something like 1,000 people's worth of prefabricated housing. And that's led some analysts to believe that Russia may be deploying air units and modern combat aircraft, or a new kind of advisory team. Now, any buildup will help Assad ride out or survive, at least for a while, the opposition. Any kind of active air presence would present serious problems for the United States, for Turkey, for the other coalition countries flying air sorties, because of the risk that there might be some kind of incident between the Russians and the air forces operating against the Islamic State. And no matter what happens, that kind of operation would present problems for the United States, because our Arab allies, particularly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, are supporting some of the forces on the ground that are opposing Assad directly.
This conflict began in 2011. It's 2015. At this point, What stands out to you as the major issues keeping us from a diplomatic solution here?
Well, I think there are several reasons, but the most important one is no one has emerged as a credible alternative. Syria is now divided really into four parts. There's a Kurdish area. The Kurds have no great incentive to be part of Syria. They were treated as second-class citizens before this began, and many didn't even have identification papers. You have the Islamic State, which occupies a significant part of eastern Syria, particularly along the river area. It's not a densely populated area, but it's one the Islamic State can actually control. You then have a mix of some 26 to 35 different opposition groups that are doing most of the fighting against Assad. They're more in the central, heavily populated areas of Syria, but they have almost nothing in common with the Assad regime, with the Islamic State, or with the Kurds. And while there are groups outside Syria that claim to represent the opposition, the fact is that many of them were tied to more moderate, secular military movements, which have effectively been defeated and virtually disappeared.
There's been quite a bit of criticism about neighboring countries not stepping in to help ease the humanitarian crisis: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. What's your analysis as why these countries have not stepped in and stepped up?
All of them, frankly, are deeply concerned at what these refugees might be and who they might have alignments with. All of them are dealing with their own problems: Iran, Yemen, Islamic State groups, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And all of them tend to be relatively closed societies where security puts very tight limits on any form of immigration.
Therefore, thou son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back, and leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel, and I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and will cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy bands, and the people that is with thee. I will give thee unto the ravenous birds of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. Thou shalt fall upon the open field, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord God. And I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them pollute my holy name any more. And the heathen shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. Behold, it is come, and it is done, saith the Lord God. This is the day whereof I have spoken. And they that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth and shall set on fire and burn the weapons, both the shields and the bucklers, the bows and the arrows, and the hand staves and the spears, and they shall burn them with fire 7 years, so that they shall take no wood out of the field, neither cut down any out of the forests, for they shall burn the weapons with fire. And they shall spoil those that spoiled them, and rob those that robbed them, saith the Lord God. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will give unto Gog a place there of graves in Israel, the valley of the passengers on the east of the sea. And it shall stop the noses of the passengers. And there shall they bury Gog and all his multitude. And they shall call it the valley of Gog. And 7 months shall the house of Israel be burying of them, that they may cleanse the land. Yea, all the people of the land shall bury them, and it shall be to them a renown the day that I shall be glorified, saith the Lord God. They shall sever out men of continual employment, passing through the land, to bury with the passengers those that remain upon the face of the earth, to cleanse it. After the end of 7 months shall they search. And the passengers that pass through the land, when any seeth a man's bone, then shall he set up a sign by it, till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Gog. And also the name of the city shall be Hamona. Thus shall they cleanse the land. And thou, son of man, thus saith the Lord God, speak unto every feathered fowl, and to every beast of the field. Assemble yourselves and come. Gather yourselves on every side to my sacrifice that I do sacrifice for you, even a great sacrifice upon the mountains of Israel, that ye may eat flesh and drink blood. Ye shall eat the flesh of the mighty, and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of goats, of bullocks, all of them fatlings of Bashan. And ye shall eat fat till ye be full, and drink blood till ye be drunken of my sacrifice, which I have sacrificed for you. Thus ye shall be filled at my table, with horses and chariots, with mighty men, with all men of war, saith the Lord God. And I will set my glory among the heathen, and all the heathen shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid upon them. So the house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day and forth. And the heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they trespassed against me. Therefore hid I my face from them, and gave them into the hand of their enemies. So fell they all by the sword. According to their uncleanness and according to their transgressions have I done unto them, and hid my face from them. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, now will I bring again the captivity of Jacob, and have mercy upon the whole house of Israel, and will be jealous for my holy name. After that they have borne their shame, and all their trespasses whereby they had trespassed against me, when they dwelt safely in their land, and none made them afraid. When I have brought them again from the people, and gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and am sanctified in them in the sight of many nations, then shall they know that I am the Lord their God, which caused them to be led into captivity among the heathen. But I have gathered them unto their own land, and have left none of them any more there. Neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel.